November 13, 1940. At Camp Holabird, Maryland, a boxy utilitarian vehicle rolled onto the Army testing grounds for evaluation. The Willys Quad, as it was designated, represented one of 3 prototypes submitted in response to the United States Army's urgent request for a lightweight reconnaissance vehicle. What distinguished this particular prototype from its competitors was its engine. Chief Engineer Delmar Roos had developed what Willys called the Go Devil, a 4-cylinder power plant producing 60 horsepower and 105 foot-pounds of torque. This exceeded the Army's minimum requirement of 85 foot-pounds and substantially outperformed the engines in the competing Bantam and Ford prototypes. Within a year, this vehicle and its successors would begin deployment to combat theaters around the world. By war's end, Army Chief of Staff George C. Marshall would characterize it as America's greatest contribution to modern warfare. The vehicle that would come to be known simply as the Jeep had arrived. The origins of this development lay in the urgent military situation of 1940. On July 11th of that year, with war consuming Europe and American entry appearing increasingly likely, the United States Army approached 135 automotive manufacturers with specifications for a quarter-ton, 4-wheel drive light reconnaissance vehicle. The existing equipment available to the Army, primarily motorcycles with sidecars and various light trucks, had proven inadequate during training exercises. The new vehicle needed to carry a crew of 3, mount a .30 caliber machine gun, feature 4-wheel drive, possess a wheelbase of no more than 75 inches, maintain a track width under 47 inches, include a fold-flat windshield, and weigh less than 1,300 pounds. Companies had just 11 days to submit bids. The winning bidder would then have 49 days to produce a working prototype and 75 days to deliver 70 test vehicles. Only 3 companies responded to these demanding specifications. American Bantam Car Company, Willys Overland Motors, and Ford Motor Company each submitted proposals. Bantam, the smallest of the 3, won the initial contract by being the only company willing to commit to the 49-day prototype deadline. Working with designer Karl Probst, Bantam delivered its prototype, nicknamed the Blitz Buggy, to Camp Holabird on September 23, 1940. The Army recognized, however, that Bantam lacked the production capacity to manufacture vehicles in the quantities that would be needed for a major war. Ford and Willys were therefore invited to submit their own prototypes, and both companies were provided access to Bantam's design specifications and the opportunity to observe the Bantam vehicle during testing. By November 1940, all 3 prototypes were undergoing evaluation at Camp Holabird. Each had exceeded the original 1,300-pound weight limit, prompting the Army to revise the specification upward to 2,160 pounds. The Willys prototype weighed 2,450 pounds, heavier than both competitors, but its superior engine performance and climbing ability impressed the evaluators. In March 1941, the Army awarded contracts for 1,500 vehicles to each manufacturer. Bantam produced the BRC-40, Ford manufactured the GP, which gave rise to one theory about the origin of the name Jeep, though the actual etymology remains disputed, and Willys built the MA. Further testing and refinement continued throughout 1941. Willys engineers worked to reduce weight, trimming body panels, and even cutting fractions of inches from bolts and fasteners. The result was the Willys MB, which met the Army's weight specifications and became the standardized design. In July 1941, Willys received a contract for 16,000 MB models at a unit price of $738.74 per vehicle. When the United States entered the war following the December 7, 1941 attack on Pearl Harbor, production accelerated dramatically. Ford was awarded a contract to manufacture the Willys design under the designation GPW, with only minor differences from the MB. Between 1941 and 1945, Willys produced approximately 363,000 MB Jeeps, while Ford manufactured roughly 280,000 GPW models. Total production reached approximately 647,000 units. During peak production periods, both companies were turning out one Jeep every 90 seconds. Approximately 30% of these vehicles, some 182,597 units, were shipped to Allied nations under the Lend-Lease program, with substantial numbers going to the Soviet Union and Great Britain. The Jeep's deployment to combat theaters revealed capabilities that transcended its basic specifications. In North Africa, where American forces first engaged German and Italian armies in significant numbers following Operation Torch in November 1942, the Jeep proved exceptionally well-suited to desert conditions. Its four-wheel drive, ground clearance, and relatively light weight allowed it to traverse sand and rocky terrain where heavier vehicles struggled. The vehicle could carry sufficient fuel and supplies for extended reconnaissance patrols, and when it did become stuck, a squad of soldiers could physically lift and maneuver it free. Its simple mechanical design, with readily accessible components and minimal specialized parts, meant that field maintenance could be performed by ordinary soldiers with basic tools. These characteristics gave American units a degree of operational mobility that contrasted sharply with the constraints facing Axis forces, whose supply lines grew increasingly tenuous as Allied naval and air power intensified. The Jeep's versatility extended far beyond its intended reconnaissance role. American forces modified the vehicles extensively for specialized missions. Jeeps mounted with 30 caliber and 50 caliber machine guns served as mobile fire support platforms. When equipped with stretcher racks, they functioned as ambulances, evacuating wounded from forward positions where larger medical vehicles could not operate. The vehicles towed anti-tank guns and light artillery pieces, carried radio equipment for forward communication posts, and transported officers between units for coordination and command purposes. Field modifications proliferated as soldiers discovered new applications. The flat hood provided a convenient surface for map consultations or field masses conducted by chaplains. The engine manifold could heat C-ration cans. Water drained from the radiator provided hot water for shaving. This adaptability made the Jeep indispensable to daily military operations across all theaters. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, wrote in his 1948 memoir, Crusade in Europe, that 4 pieces of equipment had come to be regarded by most senior officers as among the most vital to success in Africa and Europe: the bulldozer, the Jeep, the 2.5-ton truck, and the C-47 transport airplane. Eisenhower noted that, curiously, none of these was designed for combat. This observation captured an essential truth about modern industrialized warfare. Victory depended not solely on the destructive power of weapon systems, but on the logistical capacity to move personnel, materiel, and information rapidly and reliably across extended operational theaters. The Jeep embodied this principle. It enabled commanders to visit forward positions and assess situations personally. It allowed reconnaissance units to probe enemy defenses and identify weak points for exploitation. It maintained communication between dispersed units operating across fluid battlefields. It evacuated casualties before wounds became fatal. These functions, unglamorous and often invisible in the historical record, proved as consequential as firepower in determining operational outcomes. The invasion of Sicily in July 1943 and the subsequent Italian campaign demonstrated the Jeep's performance in mountainous terrain. American and Allied forces fighting their way up the Italian peninsula encountered conditions drastically different from North African deserts. Narrow mountain roads, steep grades, and persistent mud challenged all vehicles. The Jeep's compact dimensions allowed it to navigate roads carved into mountainsides where larger vehicles could not pass. Its power-to-weight ratio enabled it to climb steep grades that stopped heavier trucks. In the mountains of Italy, the Jeep's ability to move supplies, evacuate wounded, and maintain communications between forward units and rear echelons proved essential to sustaining offensive operations against determined German defensive positions. The cross-channel invasion of Normandy on June 6, 1944, placed the Jeep in the most demanding conditions it would face. Jeeps were loaded into landing craft and driven directly onto the beaches under fire. Their small size allowed them to be carried in the large gliders used to insert airborne forces behind German lines. Once ashore, American units immediately employed jeeps for reconnaissance and liaison missions. The bocage country of Normandy, with its ancient hedgerows forming natural defensive barriers, created a battlefield of small enclosed fields where maneuver was severely restricted, yet American forces maintained an operational tempo that prevented German defenders from establishing coherent defensive lines. Jeep-equipped reconnaissance units probed multiple approach routes simultaneously, identified German strongpoints, and allowed American commanders to redirect attacks toward less heavily defended positions. This tactical flexibility, enabled in large part by the Jeep's mobility, prevented the campaign from degenerating into the static trench warfare that had characterized the Western Front in World War I. German forces recognized the Jeep's value and actively sought to capture functioning examples. U.S. Army historian Hugh Cole, interviewing Wehrmacht generals following their surrender, found that they admired the Jeep more than anything else in the American arsenal. German troops who captured Jeeps employed them for reconnaissance missions, command vehicles, and general transportation. The vehicle's simplicity and reliability made it preferable to many German military vehicles, particularly as the Wehrmacht's logistical situation deteriorated under sustained Allied bombing of German industry and transportation networks. During the Ardennes offensive in December 1944, German commando forces under Otto Skorzeny's command used captured American uniforms and vehicles, including jeeps, in infiltration operations designed to spread confusion behind American lines. While these operations achieved limited tactical success, they demonstrated German appreciation for the Jeep's capabilities. The disparity in mobility between American and German forces by 1944 reflected fundamental differences in industrial capacity and military organization. A typical German infantry division at that stage of the war possessed only a few dozen motor vehicles. The bulk of the division's transport consisted of horses and horse-drawn wagons. Artillery moved at the pace of draft animals. Supply trains covered perhaps 20 miles per day under good conditions. American divisions, by contrast, were essentially fully motorized. Even infantry companies possessed organic vehicle transport, including jeeps for officers and headquarters personnel. This mobility advantage allowed American units to redeploy rapidly, concentrate forces at decisive points, and exploit breakthroughs before German defenses could solidify. The Jeep, produced in quantities exceeding 640,000 units by war's end, was central to this mobility advantage. Its very abundance, the fact that American forces could afford to assign vehicles to functions that German forces would have consolidated out of necessity, represented a form of military power that transcended tactical skill or operational art. The liberation of France during August and September 1944 illustrated the strategic consequences of this mobility disparity. Following the breakout from the Normandy beachhead, Allied forces pursued retreating German armies across France toward the German frontier. American mechanized columns, with Jeep-equipped reconnaissance units ranging far ahead of the main formations, identified river crossings, located German rearguards, and directed airstrikes against retreating enemy forces. The speed of the American advance, which covered hundreds of miles in a matter of weeks, would have been impossible without the tactical mobility provided by vehicles like the Jeep. German forces, attempting to withdraw and re-establish defensive positions along the German border, found themselves unable to disengage cleanly. American units repeatedly outpaced German withdrawal movements, cutting off retreating formations and capturing thousands of prisoners, along with substantial quantities of equipment. The Ardennes offensive of December 1944, Germany's final major counteroffensive in the West, tested American defensive flexibility. When German forces achieved tactical surprise and penetrated deeply into American lines, the response required rapid redeployment of substantial forces to threatened sectors. The 101st Airborne Division's movement to Bastogne, where it conducted a defense that became legendary, was accomplished by truck transport, but once in position, the division relied heavily on jeeps for internal communication, artillery forward observation, and casualty evacuation during the siege. American artillery units, equipped with jeeps to move forward observers, and maintained communications with firing batteries, coordinated fire against German armored columns with an efficiency that German artillery, hampered by fuel shortages and disrupted communications, could not match. The subsequent American counteroffensive that drove German forces back across the frontier depended on the same mobility that had characterized earlier operations. By May 1945, when German forces surrendered, the Jeep had become inseparably associated with American military power. War correspondent Ernie Pyle, who spent extensive time with frontline troops, described it as a divine instrument of wartime locomotion, noting that it did everything, went everywhere, proved as faithful as a dog, as strong as a mule, and as agile as a goat, constantly carrying twice what it was designed for while continuing to function. This assessment, from a journalist who observed the vehicle under actual combat conditions, captured the essence of the Jeep's contribution. It was not an elegant piece of engineering. Its suspension was basic. Its accommodations were Spartan. It offered no protection from weather or small arms fire, yet it worked. It functioned reliably under conditions that would disable more sophisticated vehicles. It could be repaired with simple tools. It performed missions its designers had never envisioned. These qualities made it indispensable. The Jeep's influence on post-war military development extended well beyond its immediate service life. The vehicle established the concept of the light utility vehicle as a fundamental component of military force structure. Every modern military utility vehicle descends conceptually from the Willys MB design. The principle that frontline units require organic transportation capable of rapid deployment and flexible employment across diverse missions has become so fundamental to contemporary military organization that it seems self-evident. Yet this concept was not inevitable. It emerged from the specific circumstances of the early 1940s, when American industry responded to military requirements by producing a simple, reliable vehicle in unprecedented quantities. The Jeep proved that mobility throughout the force structure could provide decisive operational advantages, that logistical capabilities could matter as much as firepower, and that industrial abundance could be converted into military effectiveness through thoughtful design and mass production. In 1991, the American Society of Mechanical Engineers designated the Willys MB Jeep an International Historic Mechanical Engineering Landmark, recognizing its significance in engineering history. The New York Museum of Modern Art includes a military Jeep in its display of 8 automobiles, regarding it as one of the very few genuine expressions of machine art. These recognitions acknowledge that the Jeep represented something more than a successful military vehicle. It embodied a particular approach to solving complex problems through simple, robust solutions that could be produced in vast quantities. The vehicle that Willys engineers developed in 1940 under severe time constraints, using available components and straightforward engineering principles, proved more consequential than many weapon systems of far greater sophistication. Its legacy persists not only in the continued production of vehicles bearing the Jeep name, but in the fundamental assumption, now universal among modern militaries, that tactical mobility must be distributed throughout the force structure rather than concentrated in specialized units. The quarter-ton, four-wheel drive truck that George C. Marshall characterized as America's greatest contribution to modern warfare achieved that status not through any single dramatic capability, but through the accumulated effect of countless tactical advantages that made it possible for Allied forces to move, communicate, and fight in ways their opponents could not match.